7 spine-chilling true stories that will haunt your dreams. That's the promise, and I'm not exaggerating. I used to be the type who rolled my eyes at late-night ghost chats, the one who laughed when friends swore their houses were haunted. Then a string of experiences, some mine, some my family's, some caught on a shaky cell phone, started showing up where I felt most safe, in cars, in beds behind curtains, at the foot of my childhood staircase. I still don't have answers. What I do have are memories that sit like a stone in my chest. Here are 7 of them. I'll start at the beginning. 1. We were 2 hours into a mountain drive after a ski trip, tires hissing on wet pavement and the car windows fogged from breath and heat. It was the kind of road where the trees press close and sound gets hungry. There's only the hum of engine and the occasional crack of abrasive tires finding a pothole. I remember how ordinary everything felt. Laughing about a bad run, trading stories about classmates we hadn't seen since high school. The radio was on low, and then, without any clear reason, the conversation slid into something heavier. Someone mentioned an old friend who'd had a rough patch. We joked about the strange ways lives unravel. I remember saying, half sarcastic, "Let's not start predicting who's next to die." The laugh died in the car. It felt like a placeholder sentence, like a thing you say because otherwise you'd have to say the unsayable. That night, alone in my motel room, I couldn't shake a feeling of wrongness, a tight, low hum under everything. I opened my laptop to catch up on emails. At 2:17 a.m., a single message came through from a classmate who lived 3 states away. The subject line was short. "Have you heard?" The body had a link and a timestamp. A car crash on the interstate. The names of 2 kids who'd been in our class. One of them was someone who'd been in the car 2 hours before in my conversation. I called the friend who'd been with me on the drive and asked if he'd said anything else. He had no memory of the specific phrasing, only that we had been talking about the fragility of things. My motel room felt suddenly very small. I didn't believe in premonitions. I wrote them off as coincidence at first, but then a pattern emerged. Weeks later, I'd find myself overhearing news crawls about tragedies in places I'd been thinking about. Once I saw footage of a place from my childhood, a bridge I used to stand on, in a story about a flood coming from miles away, a flood I'd pictured in nervous dreams the night before. The weirdness wasn't theatrical or loud. It was the sense of parallel lines bending together. It made me notice when certain images or phrases packed more weight than they should, as if someone else was laying a hand on the world at the same time I was looking. The thing about premonition is that it's a thief of rational distance. When you hear a few of them, the mind wants to close ranks around explanation. Sleep patterns, coincidence, selective memory. You try those explanations, unlike clothes. Some of them fit, some feel like a coat 2 sizes too small. The night in the motel left me unsettled because it wasn't a single eerie image or a cold draft. It was a sense that conversation itself had hooked into something outside of itself and looped back with consequence. It was the smallest, most ordinary sentence, a joke that landed like a bell toll in the hours after. That feeling followed me home. I found myself checking in on old friends more often, sending messages that began, "Hey, just checking because I had this weird thought," and being surprised, over and over, by how often something bad or strange had actually happened. I started to catalog these moments in a little private list on my phone. It was, at first, a mental exercise to prove to myself that it was nonsense. Then the list grew longer than I liked, and somewhere among the neat timestamps and short headlines, the hair on the back of my neck learned to stand at attention. If that sounds like an opener to a different kind of horror, the slow accumulation of unease, that's because it is. But the most convincing things weren't coincidences of news items. They were the times when the world pressed in on my family, where sound and touch and sight became the language of whatever was there. That's where the stories stop being philosophical puzzles and start being things that wake you up with a wet hand on your arm. If you're into creepy true stories, do the simple thing. Like and subscribe. There's more coming that you won't want to miss. 2. Apartment disturbances started as minor annoyances. A toothbrush knocked off the sink and landed in the middle of the bathroom floor. A stack of loose change that had been in a tin by the door rattled as if a small animal had decided to climb out of it. My partner laughed at first. "Must be the wind," she said, though we lived on the 3rd floor with double-glazed windows and no draft. The dog, Luna, was the first to take it seriously. She'd be curled in a living room sunspot and then, suddenly, lift her head and stare at the doorway, as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. The small things kept happening. A chair swayed when no one was sitting in it. Toothpaste would smear itself across the toothbrush in a way that made no sense. Strokes that looked deliberate, like handwriting. At night, I would leave an object on the kitchen counter. A spoon, a paperback, a coin. By the morning, it would be somewhere else. Once, my wallet disappeared entirely for 2 hours and turned up in the bathtub, unopened. When I opened the living room closet to grab a jacket, I felt, not heard, not seen, but felt a pressure in the air behind me. The hair along my arms stiffened, and it was as if someone had breathed very close to my ear and laughed. That was all small terror. Then the voice started. It happened one Sunday afternoon when my partner had gone to run errands. I was home alone, making coffee, wearing a hoodie with the hood up because the apartment draft made the room feel like a cave. Luna lay at my feet and kept shifting her weight, ears pricked. I heard faintly the kind of sound you only register when you're listening for it. A soft knock, then another. The doorbell has never worked properly, so a knock got my attention. I peered through the peephole. No one was there. I shrugged and went back to the kettle. Then I heard my partner's voice call my name from the bedroom, her specific cadence, a little sing-song at the end. I called back, "Yeah?" No answer. I walked to the bedroom doorway and felt the floor vibrate slightly under my feet. The voice called again, closer now, unmistakable. It sounded like her, down to a small habitual laugh at the end of a sentence. It said my name and asked if I'd left the window open. I felt my throat go dry. It wasn't a voice coming from the bedroom. It came from behind me and under me at once, like air squeezed out of a pillow. Luna bolted from the couch and leapt into my arms, soaking one side of my hoodie with saliva as she trembled. I stared at the doorway, and then I heard the sound of something sliding along the field stone of the radiator, a scraping that made the bones under my scalp ache. The hair at the nape of my neck stood on end. I walked slowly to the kitchen and turned on every light. The apartment felt too well lit, as if light itself couldn't penetrate whatever that sound was trying to do. The voice stopped. That night, sleep was shallow and twitchy. Midway through the early morning, with the city light leaking in streaks through the curtains, I woke because something pressed on my chest. It wasn't just a weight. It was the specific, awful suffocation of being held down. I fought to turn over and felt an intense pressure at the base of my throat, like a hand across my windpipe. It was a short, crushing thing, and it was accompanied by a whispering in my ear, syllables and noises that weren't words but felt structured to be recognizably speech. The whisper was low, shaped like my partner's voice, but wrong, as if a cassette had been slowed down. It was locally aggressive, like someone trying desperately to make me hear. When I could move again, I sat up, and the apartment was cold, like winter had folded itself into the room. Luna was at my chest, ears flat, lips retracted in a small, frightened snarl. I called my partner and told her what had happened. She suggested sleep paralysis or nightmares. I had heard of sleep paralysis, when your body stays asleep while your mind wakes up and you feel pressure or a presence. I dismissed it in the past. Now, having felt it, it was an animal-level terror. And the voice, that imitation of someone I loved, wasn't something sleep paralysis necessarily explained. I could hear that voice at the exact pitch she used for the phrase, "Did you leave the window?" even when she'd been at work across town. After that, the apartment turned its attention to ritual. The ring doorbell began chimes at 3:03 a.m. with nobody there, over and over. The chime would ring 3 times, pause, and then ring again. Once, I watched the app and saw only a black rectangle. No figure, nothing. Yet the chime kept sounding in the house, like someone stood at the glass just out of frame. My partner started leaving a light on by the bedroom because the darkness seemed to make things easier for whatever was moving through. I confess, I also began leaving a glass of water on the kitchen table at night. It was silly, and I don't know why. Small rituals for a strange unease. The glass would sometimes be knocked to the floor the next morning and remain intact, lying on its side as if the force that had tipped it had been careful. Neighbors started to complain too. The person below us swore she could hear murmuring at odd hours, the kind of low chant that vibrates through floorboards. My brother called to say that his girlfriend had felt uncomfortable in our flat during a weekend visit, a presence at the window, a cold spot near the hall. The narrative of a single apartment anomaly stretched into something that intersected with other people's experiences. The idea that it belonged to just me or just my partner no longer made sense. The worst escalation didn't happen that week or even that month. It was over a slow, grinding progression, the way a bruise spreads beneath skin. Voices imitating loved ones will make a rational person double back and check facts, replay conversations, look for an explanation in wiring, in audio bleed, in a neighbor's prank. We checked the security feeds. The clips showed static or blank frames when the chime rang. Once the infrared camera captured a faint gray smudge at 3:05 a.m., like breath on a cold window, and a handful of frames later, something dropped into frame, a scattering of tiny dark seeds falling from above onto the windowsill. The clip didn't explain who or what had placed them. We had no plant in the apartment that shed seeds like that. It felt, in the video, like a private act by some invisible hand. I don't want to make this sound theatrical. Most nights nothing overt happened, but the nights that did were decisive. They eroded confidence in normalcy. People began to talk differently around us. My partner started leaving a light on in the kitchen for the dog and herself, then for me. Luna's howls became strange little announcements in the night that left my heart pounding. The air in our apartment began to feel like a room crowded by the memory of other things. Not quite occupied, but thick with the notion of occupation. And by the time my mother came to visit and reported that her echoing footfalls had sounded like something else in the walls, like knocks replying from within, we stopped pretending it might be only our imagination. Her voice on the phone the next morning was thin, and she said, "It felt like it reached into me." She wasn't the kind of person to say that lightly. If that sounds like contagious fear, it's because it was. Once a place feels wrong to one person, other people notice things that they might have otherwise shrugged off. The apartment became a place everyone treated as fragile and liable to break into something else. And once you treat a space like that, you see things through lenses that make ordinary quirks sinister. If you think that was creepy, wait until you hear about what haunted my childhood house. 3. The house where I grew up wasn't large, but it had a long way of rooms and corners where sound could hide. It sat on a ridge with woods behind it, and in winter, the minnows of frost that pricked the windows. Childhood is a strange grain in memory, big feelings made of small things. For me, the small things in that house assembled into a geometry of fear. The first image I remember is a window in my parents' living room. At certain times in the evening, the window would look like a black mirror, and I would see a shape standing just beyond the glass. It was never fully formed, a smear, a taller shadow than any neighbor's hedge or gutter, a vertical wrongness. Once, I pressed my face to the pane, and it felt like the shape looked back with an intensity that made the glass seem to breathe. I told my mother. She told me it was a trick of the light. She made me sleep in the same bed and said she tucked me in. I believed her for a while, until the nights when a long, slow scraping started at the living room window and moved around the house in a deliberate, almost investigative way. It would scrape the sill, pause, move to the next window, and start again. The sound was like claws against wood. My earliest direct attack, which I would later describe in adult terms as being pinned, happened on a summer night when I was maybe 8. I woke with the sensation that something heavy sat on the bed, leaning into me with a pressure so specific it blotted out breath. I turned on my side to crawl to the edge and felt a wet, cold slap against the back of my hand, like a large hand with fur. I tried to kick, but my legs felt thick as rubber. I remember this not as a cinematic terror, but as a tactile impossibility. The bed was both full of weight and utterly still. I finally screamed, and the pressure lifted. My parents came running and found me pale and shaking. They chalked it up to a nightmare. My mattress was soaked in sweat. Another time, I saw a huge arm, hairy, corded, ending in a set of fingers with curved nails, reaching from behind the armchair in the den. It hung there for a long time, suspended as if the person attached to it bent to tie a boot. The arm was wrong in scale, like someone had borrowed a giant's limb and hung it up to dry. I ran upstairs and hid under the covers. The memory of that arm is a tactile thing. It feels like a glove made of shadow with sap on the fingertips. There were chases downstairs and into the backyard when I was 12. I remember running bare feet on cold boards, feeling the house shake with something moving in thumbs and stomps behind me. The back door was stuck once, and I had to kick it open with everything I had because the thing at my heels seemed to prefer catching me in the doorway. Out in the yard, the trees pressed together like people at a party. The only light came from the neighbor's window and the moon. I turned and there was nothing, just the weight of leaves in the back of my own neck sweating with fear. As I grew older, the sightings moved away from quick flashes and became moments of clarity that didn't feel like dreams. Once, when I was 17 and sleep-deprived from studying for finals, I woke to the sensation of someone standing at the foot of my bed and looking down at me. I couldn't see them at first. I could only feel their presence. I opened my eyes to a silhouette taller than the ceiling seemed to allow, like a figure squeezed into my small room. It was a tall, dark man with shoulders that formed a perfect V, a head pulled down into a hood I couldn't make out, and hands that stayed clasped in front of him. He didn't move. He just stood there for an uncalculated length of time and then walked very deliberately to the window and looked out, as if saying farewell to something he could see better than I could. When I told my friends, they joked that it was stress or some late-teen combination of stimulants and anxiety. Yet the phenomenon had consistency I had trouble explaining away. The rightness of little details, like a particular scent following the figure. A wet, earthy smell like the floor of a cave, or sometimes like compost. The dog next door would start howling as if someone had called it, and the porch light would blink thrice when the figure left. There's a section of the woods behind my house where a man named Earl used to chop timber. He was a tall, quiet sort who mended fences, and sometimes told local kids to stay out of the deeper brush. Once, years after the first scrapes and the arm behind the chair, Earl told me he'd seen a kid pelting through the trees at dusk and thought it was me. He pursued, calling. But when he reached the break, where our yard ended and the thick trees began, the sound in the brush stopped. He found footprints that led into the woods and ended in a small, neat circle where the ground was packed down as if something had been standing there. There was no exit spoor. He said the impression in the dirt looked like something took a breath there and remained still. He refused to go near the spot after dark. That episode changed the way my parents spoke about the place. The practical, salt-of-the-earth language of my father softened into something more careful. He began leaving lights on in hallways and checking windows twice. We moved the couch so the back never faced windows at night. My mother took to putting a small figurine of a saint near our front door, more out of habit than belief. Things that had once been kids' imaginations acquired a tone of long memory in their voices. Parents have a way of cataloging what they cannot explain as a list of tasks. Call someone, hire a repairman. But with this, there was a surrendered strand of something older. Keep watch. As I grew, the sightings and attacks reduced but didn't entirely stop. They retreated into odd hours. There were times when, years later, my sister would call from college and say something like, "Remember when the thing scratched the back of the armchair?" And I would hear the same tremor in her voice, the same laundry list of small weirdnesses. Sometimes she'd tell me of objects flung from under her bed that later turned up in the hallway, toys that would smear toothpaste in patterns, and the way the shadows in the closet looked like a collection of small shapes leaning together. When I left for college, the house felt less like a set of rooms and more like an aggregating memory. The window, the arm, the way footsteps never quite matched up with posters on the wall. I left with a backpack full of textbooks and a small tremor of relief. I did not truly leave the house behind. Those memory scratches stayed with me in ways that made me careful about long hallways and bright lights at night. Years later, standing in my own apartment, I would recognize the small touches. A scrape in wood that echoes like claws. A voice that takes the shape of someone I love. If that childhood part of my life sounds like a slow burn movie in which the house accrues character like bad weather, it is. But the house didn't only lend me fear, it gave my family a vocabulary for the kinds of things we would later encounter. The scratches, the arm, the window, they were not isolated incidents, but a preface. And when something follows you from the place you grew up into the places you make as an adult, it has a way of reminding you that familiarity is not always a shield. Two related episodes from my childhood home, the underbed flinging and an adult's odd, almost benign description of a presence, are part of how my family learned to respond, not with ritual or exorcism, but with quiet avoidance and finally movement. That pattern repeats in other stories I'll tell, where the choice to leave was as decisive as any prayer or argument. But before we get to the underbed stuff, there's a story about a mobile home my sister lived in that she still refuses to discuss without a pause. It involves things that came from under the bed, and a supposed explanation from someone who claimed he could see them, and that leads into others that grow stranger, and stranger still. The night my sister called from that mobile home, her voice was small. She told me, in halting sentences, that toys and objects were being thrown from under her bed without anyone touching them. Dolls would appear at the foot of the stairs. A soccer ball would roll into the hallway from the bedroom with no force behind it. Once, our neighbor found a spread of pennies across the living room floor and swore she hadn't left them there. Our family started to nod at one another across the phone lines. We began to catalog similar things that had happened across time and space, admitting, reluctantly, that these weren't all oddities with neat physical explanations. At this point, things start folding together into a pattern, small acts of mischief that accumulate into something less playful, something that wears a shape of will. People would tell me, on different occasions, that they'd felt watched at night in places that had once been safe. A grandmother would call to say that handprints appeared on a hospital window during a rainstorm, small and wet, as if the child who made them had pressed their hands to the glass. An aunt described waking up to find her bedside lamp moved by an invisible force, not thrown but shifted, as if someone had adjusted the light to see more clearly. Those patterns, the tactile, the visual, the audible, started to line up in ways that made the idea of coincidence feel inadequate. They suggested a vocabulary, small, intrusive acts that puncture domestic space. They suggested persistence, and they suggested a widening. What started in my childhood house was not confined there. That is where the next stories pick up speed. Places that should have been temporary. A lakeside cabin, a farm stay in a rural hill town, a rented house in a country I visited, becoming stages for the same small invasions. The thing that followed us did not care much for borders or logic. It cared about the edges of human activity, creeping in where there was quiet or where attention slipped. The stories that follow trace the slow escalation from being fiddled with to outright chased, from a laugh in the dark to a pressure on the throat. They will take us into an isolated cabin where a thud at the back door changes everything, into a house where handprints appear on windows that were locked, and finally to a farmhouse and a house in Nicaragua where seeds fall from nowhere. But before I get to the cabin, there's one more memory from my childhood that sits in the space between mischievous and malevolent. A night when my sister swore something had whispered her name in the dark and the dog refused to enter her room. She told me later that a local medium, someone my parents had briefly consulted out of desperation rather than belief, had said something odd. The presence there was A man with no eyes, gentle but asking to be seen. That description, as ridiculous as it was, changed how my parents looked at the place. They stopped laughing openly and began to talk in low voices. People don't necessarily call a medium because they want to prove anything to anyone. Sometimes it's an act of admitting you can't find a practical solution. The medium's words carried an odd tenderness and an image that lodged in our minds. A man with no eyes, watching. That image, whether meaningful or not, was the last straw for my parents. They decided to move. We packed up a life with all the usual pain of leaving a house you love and the relief of leaving the parts of it that scared you. Moving felt like a gamble that you can pack fear into boxes and write fragile on it, hoping the next place will be lighter. But as I learned, and as these stories show, fear is sometimes a suitcase that opens when you least expect it. And yet, even after we left, echoes persisted. A window left ajar in a house we'd sold, a crack in an old floorboard in a vacancy that neighbors reported moving like a breath, as if something had never quite left with our boxes. That was not only unsettling, it was instructive. It prepared me for places that claimed to be safe because they had fresh paint and polite cleaning. Safety, as I would learn, is a condition we name for comfort, not a guarantee. So we leave the childhood house for now, with its windows and its hairy arm and its weird little rituals. Next up, the mobile home and the under-the-bed entity that kept flinging toys into the hall, and then the cabin by the lake where bangs on the wall pushed a family to flee. But before I go on, and I promise, the next tales step up in a way that makes your skin crawl. I should say this, I am not telling you these stories to scare you into disbelief in rational things. I am telling them because once they started, they changed how my family and I moved through space. They took common rooms and turned them into places that felt observed. And more than anything, they taught me to notice the small things, because often the small things build up to the big ones. There's more. The next story begins in a cramped mobile home on a windless evening, with a sister who decided she couldn't sleep in her room without checking the closet twice. The things that came from under the bed were not violent at first. They were inconvenient, then mischievous, then deliberate. That's where the momentum picks up again, and where a stranger's explanation starts to hang in the air like the scent of old wood and rain. The couple who visit that mobile home later will not leave the same person they arrived as. Their visit ends with a thud on the grandparents' door that nobody can explain. 4. My sister's mobile home was a place of patched linoleum and the kind of light that makes everything look smaller and older. She moved there after a rough breakup, needing cheap rent and a roof over her head. For the first few weeks, I joked about the wallpaper and the smell of fried onions that seemed permanently embedded in the vents. Then the small things started happening. It began at night. Toys would be at the foot of the stairs when she woke up, though there was no child in the house. A soccer ball rolled into the hallway from the bedroom with a lazy, deliberate momentum, as if someone had nudged it with purpose. Once she opened her closet and found a neat row of pennies spread in a semicircle across the floor, faces up, like a child playing a ritualistic game. She told me she assumed a neighborhood kid had come by to play and left them, but the closet latch was hooked and the tiny metal crescent was warm, as if the coins had been handled recently. The pattern built slowly, a nuisance that felt almost mischievous at first. Dolls were found in impossible places, positioned to face the door. Her bedside lamp would be moved a few inches to the left, as if someone had needed to see the right side of the bed. Once, she woke to find a paperback textbook balanced on the edge of the bathtub sill, open to a page she'd been avoiding for a week. The kind of thing you could explain away with forgetfulness or fatigue, until the night the toys began to fly. She called me in tears and laughing at the same time, the strange combination of hysteria and disbelief somebody uses when they don't want to seem foolish. She described a night when she'd heard a series of small thumps under the bed. She knelt and looked and saw nothing. A few seconds later, a stuffed animal rocketed out from under the frame and hit the foot of her bed, bouncing across the floor as if someone had thrown it with force. She swore the mattress dipped as if the thrower had stepped back. The hair on her arms rose. She took photos with her phone, and the images showed a motion blur near the bed, nothing more than a smear of dark. She swore at me she'd felt watched. Our neighbor, an older woman who kept her curtains half open and knew everything that happened on our street, told my mother she'd seen small things moving at night in the yard when she looked out. She wouldn't come up to the mobile home after dusk. The escalation felt less like a prank and more like intention. When things become intentional, you stop treating explanation like a comfortable coat you can put on and take off. You have to decide whether to stay warm or to walk out into the cold. In a moment of exhausted desperation, my parents, who by then had started to believe that the world sometimes produces problems you can't solve with a weekend and dollar store tools, made an appointment with a woman from town who said she could see things most people didn't. I remember being skeptical on the drive there, a steady stream of sarcastic comments and nervous laughter that didn't quite land. My sister sat rigid in the passenger seat, staring out the window like she expected something to be standing in the maze of cornfields we passed. The woman had a small house full of things that smelled like incense and old fabric. She talked slowly and used phrases that were half metaphor and half bookkeeping. "There's a man who stays," she said, not as a prediction, but as a tired note. "He's old and he's missing his sight." "Ah." She paused and looked at my sister as if giving permission to be afraid. She said the presence wasn't violent, that it seemed to enjoy mischief and attention, but that it was asking gently and clumsily to be noticed. "It likes to be seen," the woman said, "but not always in ways that help us. Humor me for a second. I don't care for the language of seers. It feels soft around the edges, like a thrifted coat that tries to pass as winter. But I remember the exact hush that fell when she described the way toys would be flung out from under the bed. Not random, she said, but with pattern. She tilted her head and used that phrase that I've heard people use when they're trying to soften an ugly thought. It seeks connection. We left with more questions than confidence, and, as a family, a strange, embarrassed exhaustion. The mobile home incident culminated one night when my sister's boyfriend, trying to prove there was a logical explanation, stayed up to watch with a flashlight and his phone camera propped on a stack of paperbacks. They left the phone running. At around 1:48 a.m., the footage caught a dark, low tremor under the bed. The mattress quivered, the blanket bunched, and the camera caught a small, hard flicker. An object moving too fast to follow. In the next frame, a row of dolls stood aligned facing the doorway. All heads turned precisely the same way. The clip offered no solution, only curiosity. It didn't prove anything, but for us, it was enough to change the way we walked through rooms. My sister moved out soon after. She told us later that the relief of closing the door behind her felt like the end of an argument she hadn't known she was having. There's an odd thing about places that have been troubled. People who visit them carry a trace back with them like a scent. My aunt stayed for a week to help my sister pack. She called my mother afterwards with a voice like it had been rinsed in ice water. "I don't know if I can explain it," she said, "but at night I heard the kind of breathing that sounds like it's trying to fit itself through a keyhole." She went back for a few things I'd left, and she refused to take the box tied with twine into her car until sunrise. We learned, in small, embarrassed ways, that the polite instincts to fix, to explain, to laugh were inadequate. Sometimes the only option was to get away, and that was not the end of it. What followed belonged to a different register of fear. Not playful mischief, but something that pressed on the body's edge, something that made a family flee a lakeside retreat in the middle of a vacation. If you think toys that throw themselves across a room are creepy, wait until you hear the sound that drove a group of adults out into a rainstorm at dawn. 5. The cabin by the lake was the kind of place postcards borrow from memory. A low wooden structure crowned with peeling shingles, a porch that hung over reed and dirt, and a view that swallowed Sunday mornings. My grandparents rented it for summers, then wintered it in the off-seasons. It had that lived-in smell of old wool and coffee. We went there for a weekend, an attempt to stitch together a family holiday that felt wholesome and carpentered. At first, it was exactly that. Wood-fired coffee, cards on the table, the dog asleep on the mat by the stove. On the second night, the air turned heavy, the kind of pressure that sits on your chest before a storm. The radio in the corner played nothing but static, like someone had tuned it to the end of the world. Then came the thuds, single, heavy knocks at the back door. They were slow and precise, timed like footsteps with a purpose. Someone rapping a rhythm that the house recognized and hated. My grandfather, who worked in a mill and believed in the sensible cadence of machines, knocked on wood and went to check, brushing his hand against the jamb, as if he could persuade whatever was outside to stop. He returned with no explanation, only a wet print on his palm like a fingerprint made of mud. The sound moved around the house from room to room, indifferent to walls. It was not the jittery, rapid tap of small animals, but a blunt, deliberate thumping that landed in the chest. The dog woke and roared like a creature that had been asked to identify an enemy and couldn't. The first night, we told ourselves it was some tramp or a raccoon. The second night, when the knocks answered the knocks from inside and a heavy bang finally landed on the back of the grandparents' door, the family stopped pretending it was playful. There was a smell that accompanied the noise, one I could not place at the time. Not rotten, not quite sweet, but like pond water left too long in a tin. It seeped into curtains and stayed, a memory smell that made ordinary things taste like iron. My grandmother swore she felt something standing in the doorway that was not a person, something that pressed her from the threshold and then receded, as if checking for a pulse. She wrapped herself in a blanket and refused to open the door again. My uncle, who had a temper that could flatten people, sat very still and did not mock. That night we heard the sound of something heavy move across the porch. A grinding, a dragging, like someone using a boot to scrape at the wood. It stopped with a final thunderous bang that shoved the entire house with a shudder. Afterward we found prints in the mud by the steps. They were large and misshapen, as if someone had made them with a loaf of bread. They led to the base of the stoop and stopped, as if the visitor had been satisfied with making a mark and not worried about the path out. On the last morning, when the sky seemed blue and ordinary, my grandparents woke to find the porch door dented on the outside with a force that could not be explained by ordinary weather. That dent, more than the knocks, was the tipping point. My grandfather, who could extract a splinter, mend a pipe, negotiate with insurers, looked at everyone and said we were leaving. He said it like a man reading a contract he could no longer argue with. There are clauses you cannot sign off on. We packed hurriedly. There was no heroism, no elaborate rituals or dramatic confrontations. We just stacked our things and drove off with the back seat full of blankets and the dog snoring, and my grandmother's hands wound tight around a rosary she said she'd never used before. The drive away from the lake felt like an unpeeling. We left a box of small things on the porch, a half-solved crossword, an enamel mug. The idea that we might return became unreal, like a sentence in a language we no longer spoke. After we fled the cabin, stories spread through the town like a rumor you let grow so it will stop nagging at you. People said that the cabin had been the site of an accident years earlier. Others said that old men used to take moonlight walks on the pier and swear they'd seen figures in the reeds. I didn't pursue the details. I didn't want to know the local history, because the immediate fact of a heavy strike on a door in a family that chose flight over explanation was enough. We learned that the cost of staying outweighed the cost of leaving. The lake story is one of those things that sits in the skull like a pebble, small, hard, and impossible to ignore. It changed the way my parents talked about what counted as a vacation and the way my family answered the phone late at night. It also introduced a pattern that repeats in other places, where the domestic meets the uncanny. Handprints that appear where no hands can reach, voices that imitate and then stop, the sense of being observed by something that does not belong to the household. If you think that was as bad as it gets, you're still not at the end. The next place I have to tell you about is the house my father bought after the lake. A decades-old structure that gathered stories like dust. It had a way of making the ordinary feel watched. A shadow at a window, handprints on a rain-speckled pane, and a tall man who watched the doorway in a way that made sleep precarious. The accounts there were multiple and corroborating, and they taught me that when more than one set of eyes sees the same thing, something in the world has changed its manners. 6. Dad's house sat on a street lined with maples that spilled their leaves in gutters. It was the sort of place where everyone knew how long the paperboy waited before calling it in. When he bought it, I remember thinking it was a small, practical victory, a place to settle between jobs, a repairman here and there, the steady stomp of a life. What I didn't know then, or chose not to know, was how many small narratives had brushed the walls. The first thing my sister told me was about the window, a child-sized print that appeared during a rainstorm. She called me, voice low, and said, "There are handprints on the outside of the hospital window." We lived far from any hospital, but the image lodged. Later, my mother told a story about a rainy night when she saw small, perfect handprints on the outside of the bedroom window, as if a little child had pressed their palms against the glass to look in. The house was locked, the streets quiet. We chalked it up to a neighbor's kid, to condensation, to childish mischief. The handprints, perfectly spaced, stayed in our memory as less a puzzle and more a warning. Small things can rent your sense of safety. There was also the tall shadow, the one that stopped me in the doorway at age 24. I woke at 3 a.m. to the noise of my mother rattling in the kitchen, the soft, impatient clack of her spoon against a mug. I got up to see if she needed anything and found, at the end of the hallway, a black figure in the window, not framed by light, but by a depth that swallowed it. It wasn't a person so much as a silhouette that fit the architecture wrong. It was tall, and its shoulders formed a sharp V that the house did not invite. I remember the smell again, a damp, earthy thing like sod after rain. The figure did not move, it simply lingered, watching out over the dark street with a patience that felt older than the house. My mother, later that week, described waking with the sense that someone had been sitting at the foot of her bed. She called it a pressure on her chest, a classic phrase for what some call sleep paralysis. But the pressure, in her telling, had hands. She said the sensation came with the certainty of someone leaning over you, their breath cold, their outline between you and the moon. She had always been practical, a woman who posted yard sale signs and kept the tea cupboard organized by color, and she told the story without drama, like one lists repairs. Yet I could tell from the way she folded the phrase into the conversation that it had lodged in her body. There were multiple little corroborations. My niece, visiting for a week, swore to my sister she'd seen a small girl in a hospital gown at the end of the corridor, pale and watching from the stair landing. She told us the child's eyes were the color of shallow water and that she didn't blink. A neighbor reported cat-like scratches on the porch and a trail of small, muddy footprints that began at the corner of the yard and ended at the door, then vanished. Another night, a babysitter left early because she said she felt watched through the window pane the whole time she'd been there. Perhaps the most unnerving incidents were the times when ordinary objects seemed to collect evidence of attention. One morning, my father found a set of wet handprints on the kitchen window facing the street. There was no child small enough to fit the spacing, and the prints were perfectly spaced as if someone of a small stature had pressed their hands there just to see inside. They didn't smudge or drip, they were precise. We talked about condensation, about the house's layout, and an engineer's logic tried to explain humidity. But the prints had a rhythm to them, like punctuation. 3 pairs, separated. Once, late at night, I woke because the dog began to warn with a single low whine. I went to the living room and saw a shadow moving along the far wall, the kind of stutter step that happens when your eyes are adjusting to darker shapes. It took me a step, and the shadow turned its head without turning its body, as if glass allowed it a pivot I didn't have. The sensation was like standing in a theater watching something backstage that hadn't been paid for its ticket. I stood very still. Whatever it was retreated into the dark. The night's most disturbing moment was a clear, raw, seconds-long episode of paralysis that still lives with me. I woke sitting bolt upright, unable to breathe. Something sat on my chest and whispering, not words I could make sense of, but a cadence like someone reciting the end of a list. I tried to move, and my limbs felt like they belonged to someone else. In the smudged light of the alarm clock, a tall, dark presence leaned over the foot of my bed. It bent, and I could make out the suggestion of shoulders and the curve of a head. It didn't scream or attempt harm, it simply looked. The look was heavy, attentive, a gaze that catalogued. I think the worst part was how ordinary it made everything else feel. It normalized the abnormal. After that episode, the house changed the way we moved inside of it. We started to leave lights on in the hallways. We slept with the radio on low. Guests left early, unsettled by a weight they had no words for. The presence seemed to be tethered to certain angles of the house. The landing, the old cellar door, the window that faced the maple at the front. We learned which rooms to avoid after midnight. There were other corroborating tales, too. A child's hospital gown left in a closet, handprints on hospital windows elsewhere in town, a neighbor who swore that on certain nights the silhouette of someone standing at the window looked not toward our street, but toward something the rest of us couldn't see. The pattern was the same, small acts, repeated, a shadow that unfolded in different people's stories until the accumulation felt like testimony, not rumor. We didn't call anyone to cleanse it. We started to live around it, to plan our nights to avoid confrontation, to treat the house like a room with a cracked tile you avoid stepping on. The Rose House, as some people later called it because a woman who sold us the home had been named Rose, left an impression of attention. It taught me that fear can be communal. Everyone in the household had stories, each slightly different, each insisting on the same reality. Something looked in at us. It worried at our edges until, once again, moving seemed like the only response that made sense. If the Rose House taught me anything, it was how consistent the uncanny can be across different people. The handprints, the tall figure, the pressure that sits on your chest and refuses to let you breathe. That consistency prepares you, in an unfortunate way, for the last story I have. The one that folded together the local and the unfamiliar. The one that ended with a camera clip and a question I still cannot answer without feeling a wash of something like cold. If the idea of a house watching you unsettles you, imagine waking in a sealed home in another country to find that small, ordinary objects are falling from the air at 3 a.m. with no obvious source. That's where we go next. 7. I had been invited to Nicaragua by a friend who'd met a local family while working on a small agricultural project. It was the kind of trip you take when you're tired of the same skyline, when you want to believe experience will wash the flimsier parts of your life clean. The house they offered me to stay in was a compact, sealed structure in a small town outside the city, heavy shutters, thick plaster walls, and the comforting smell of coffee and wood smoke in the mornings. It was technically secure, doors fit tightly, windows latched. It felt at first like a retreat. The first night I slept well, the air was a balm. The second night I woke to the sensation of something tumbling gently onto the wooden sill of my window. I thought it was rain or an insect. I stood up and peered through the shutters. Nothing. By the third night the phenomenon had a schedule. At roughly 3 a.m. a soft patter would begin, like tiny pebbles falling in slow, punctuated beats. When I opened the shutters in the morning, the windowsill was dusted in small, dark seeds, round, almost bead-like, perhaps from a neem tree or some local shrub. I collected some in my hand and turned them over under my headlamp. They were seeds, clean and dry, as if someone had been emptying a small pouch over the sill. I told myself there was a natural explanation. Birds, a crack in a roof, a nocturnal squirrel using an old nest. The locals smiled and said, "We get it sometimes. It is the trees." But the next night I set up a small infrared camera in the corner of the room, pointed at the ceiling and window. I did not expect it would show anything but the dark and the slow crawl of a moth. At 3:12 a.m., the clip registered a faint flaring of light near the ceiling above the bed. The footage, grainy and indifferent, showed a soft blur detached from the darkness, and a handful of small objects fall in an even scatter onto the windowsill. The camera caught none of the arcs, typical of birds or insects. There was no form that descended from the eaves, no shadow of a creature passing the window. And yet there were the seeds, falling in an orderly shower, landing with no visible hand behind them. I should say plainly, a clip is not a verdict. It is a piece of data you fit into the puzzle. It suggested an event with no visible agent, which is far stranger in practice than in the telling. The footage was small and baffling. It left me with the same odd weight I feel when I recall the motel email years earlier. A compression of coincidence into a pattern that isn't explained by the normal checks and balances of logic. The family I was staying with took it more seriously than I expected. The mother, a woman with hands worn by planting and a laugh that made the dogs come, confessed she had nightmares where a black shape stood in the doorway. She described, in a hushed voice, waking to find seeds on the windows in patterns that looked intentional, sometimes aligned in neat rows that suggested someone had been counting. One of the local women said the seeds sometimes spelled out shapes if you left them undisturbed, small arrangements that looked like children's hopscotch grids or glyphs. I looked at her then and felt the first prickling in my scalp. That animal awareness that some people call intuition and others call superstition. As if that were not strange enough, there was a separate episode at a nearby working farm where we spent an afternoon. The couple who ran it were warm and hospitable, offering us roasted coffee and fresh goat cheese. They asked us to stay for dinner, and as the evening darkened, brought out a dish they prepared for gatherings. Roasted meat and odd condiments, a display that, to my outsider eyes, seemed steeped in local ritual. Later, in the barn, one of the workers jokingly propped a sheep's leg on a workbench and said something about old farmers' rights. It felt like benign folkloric talk until I noticed symbols scratched on the fence posts, small marks that repeated in a partial circle, like shorthand. I'm not a linguist of gestures, but the marks felt intentional, a code I did not know. That night I dreamed of a black thing that moved like a shadow slipping off the wall. When I woke, I found the bed covers kinked and a handful of seeds scattered over my nightstand. My phone, which had been on airplane mode, had a single message from the mother of the family. Last night the seeds fell in a circle around the crib, she wrote. The baby slept as if lulled. She added, almost apologetically, that an elder in the town had once told her to leave a bowl of water under the window as a courtesy. The courtesy gesture felt like an ancient social contract. Do this, and maybe the thing will be less curious. The camera footage, which I watched with my friend and later with the family, created a quiet unrest. It didn't point to a human in the rafters. It showed things falling, and that was enough to leave a question mark so large it shaded any attempt at tidy explanation. I could imagine a micro crack in the ceiling where seeds from an old stash of roofing material leaked, or an animal with a pouch that distributed contents in an unusual way. I can imagine many things. None of them, when turned over and considered, felt wholly satisfactory. Before I left the country, I had one last conversation with the elderly neighbor who lived across the dirt road. She told me, in a soft voice, that when she was a girl they used to call the sound of seeds falling the counting. They dropped them, she said, tapping her cheek as a gesture for thought, like someone is keeping score. She did not offer moral judgment. She folded the idea like a seam in a shirt. We live with it, she added. We listen and we put out water. I have told you these things in the most careful way I can. The seeds were an oddity I could show on a clip and still not explain. The farm had its marks and rituals. The neighbors had their own languages for what they faced. The scare of it was not in a violent attack, but in the intimacy of small objects being placed in your private spaces at night. The intimacy is the alarming part. The world rearranging itself on a quiet scale you weren't invited to notice. On the drive out of the town, under a sky that had the particular clarity of the tropics, I caught myself looking at every farmhouse and window as if it might be turned inside out. I thought about the cabin and the knocks, about the apartment voice that could imitate someone I loved, about the long arm in my childhood den, the mobile home with its flying dolls, and the rose house with its handprints. Each place had a grammar of attention. Each event had a way of insisting we were not the only witnesses to the world's hilarity and cruelty. The last clip I saved on my phone, the infrared frame that showed seeds falling without a visible source, sits on my device like a small stone. I watch it sometimes, not because I expect it to offer an answer, but because watching it makes me feel less alone in an uncertainty that hums at the edge of ordinary life. I carry it like a relic that is not holy and not sinister, only a record of the way the world can move when nobody else is looking. Conclusion. I used to think that ghost stories were a form of entertainment, a way to flirt with fear in safe, polite doses. These 7 episodes taught me that the real thing is quieter and more persistent than a jump scare. It works by taking the ordinary and rearranging it. A tin of coins that rattles in the night, a voice that learns how to say your partner's name, a smear of handprints on glass, the slow fall of seeds where no branch reaches. The uncanny doesn't always demand a finale. Sometimes its cruelty is that it simply keeps asking questions. If there's any through line in these stories, it's this. The places we come to call home are porous. Walls, windows, beds, they keep you because you expect them to. When expectation frays, you discover how tightly your sense of safety is stitched to the small certainties of habit. The incidents here didn't resolve into a theory. They asked me to be more careful with my assumptions and more forgiving of my family's instincts when they chose to leave. I have not offered explanations. I have given you what I know. Personal memories, videos that complicate rather than clarify, the reports of people I love. I leave you with the one simple truth that has guided my life since. If enough independent witnesses notice the same wrongness in a place, it is no longer private. It becomes a communal oddity that we respond to the best way we can, by moving, by watching, by telling the story so others know what to notice. Share your own experiences in the comments. If you've had a night where the house felt like a stranger, say that it happened. Tell me how you reacted. If nothing else, these stories are a kind of map showing the edges where the familiar phrase. Subscribe if you want more accounts like these. I'll keep collecting them, cautious and curious. For now, lock your windows, if only because it feels like the polite thing to do, and remember, some of the strangest things in the world arrive not with a scream, but with a small, deliberate tap at 3 in the morning.